A GoodKnight story. In the autumn of 1098 AD, a silver-armored knight rode with the forces of King Peter I of Aragon toward a fortress perched on a limestone cliff in the Alto Palancia valley, where 1,400 Almoravid warriors waited behind walls of rammed earth to defend the strategic choke point that could decide the fate of the entire Levante. The skirmish of Jerica was not a grand clash of empires. It was something far more intimate and brutal, a grinding, close-quarters melee fought on terraced slopes, slick with blood, where the crack of maces on helmets drowned out the screams of dying men, and where our good knight would emerge shaken, bloodied, and forever marked by the loss of brothers-in-arms whose names he would carry to his grave. This was the Reconquista at its rawest, not the romantic tales of chivalry, but the surgical violence of frontier warfare, where every yard of ground was purchased with shattered lances and crushed skulls, and where the fate of kingdoms hung on the courage of a few hundred men willing to charge into the drumming darkness of the Almoravid phalanx. Watch as the good knight survives the concussive hell of medieval combat, as the Aragonese milites and Almogavar mountaineers execute a flanking maneuver that shatters the Berber line, and as the strategic road to Valencia is secured one brutal sword stroke at a time. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive journeys into the forgotten battles that forged nations, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks you through history's most visceral moments with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which medieval siege or skirmish you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in and ride with us to the blood-soaked slopes of Jerica. Chapter 1. The Valley of Shadows. The Palancia River ran cold in the autumn of 1098, its waters the color of old iron as they carved through the limestone gorges of the Alto Palancia. The good knight rode in the second file of the Aragonese column, his destrier's hooves striking the rocky path with a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The silver of his mail hauberk caught the pale morning light, each of the 12,000 interlocking rings a small prayer against the violence that awaited. He had ridden this road before, or roads like it. The frontier between Christian Aragon and the Almoravid-held territories was a landscape of constant flux, where castles changed hands with the seasons and where every river crossing might conceal an ambush. But Jerica was different. Jerica mattered. Ahead, the column stretched like a steel serpent, 150 knights of the royal mesnada, their kite shields painted with the crosses and lions of their houses, their lances held upright like a forest of ire saplings. Behind them came the peonies, armored spearmen whose equipment was humbler but whose resolve was no less fierce. And ranging on the flanks, moving through the olive groves and rocky outcrops with the ease of mountain goats, were the Almogavars. These frontier warriors wore no mail, only sheepskin tunics and leather gaiters, but they carried javelins and heavy knives, and they knew this terrain as intimately as a lover's body. The good knight's squire, a boy of 15 named Sancho, rode close beside him. The boy's face was pale beneath his simple iron cap, his eyes wide as they took in the landscape. This was Sancho's first real campaign, his first taste of what it meant to ride with the king's host into contested ground. "How far to the fortress?" Sancho asked, his voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves and the creak of leather. The good knight did not answer immediately. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with the instinct that came from years of survival on the frontier. The valley was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The wind carried a scent that made his destrier's nostrils flare. Smoke and something else. Fear, perhaps. Or death. "Not far," he said finally. "You'll see the Peña Tejada soon. The rock that looks like God took a blade to it." Sancho nodded, swallowing hard. The good knight could see the boy's hands trembling on the reins. He remembered that trembling. He remembered the first time he had ridden toward a fortified position, the first time he had understood that the songs of the troubadours were lies, that war was not glory, but a grinding, exhausting horror that left men broken in body and spirit. "Stay close to me," the good knight said. "When the fighting starts, don't think. Just move. Your body knows what to do." It was a lie, of course. The body knew nothing. The body wanted only to flee, to curl into a ball and wait for the terror to pass. But the lie was necessary. The boy needed something to hold on to. The column rounded a bend in the river, and there it was, the Peña Tejada. The fortress of Xerica rose from the limestone promontory like a crown of stone, its walls the color of old bone, its towers watching the valley with the patient malevolence of a predator. The Palancia River wrapped around the eastern and southern faces of the rock, creating a natural moat of vertical cliffs. The only approach was from the northwest, where the slope, though steep, was navigable. The good knight felt his stomach tighten. He had seen fortresses like this before. They were killers. Every yard of that slope would be contested. Every step would be paid for in blood. King Peter I rode at the head of the column, his banner, the red and gold bars of Aragon, snapping in the wind. He was a young man, barely 30, but he carried himself with the authority of one who had been born to command. Beside him rode his standard-bearer and his closest advisers, men whose names were whispered in the halls of power from Barcelona to Valencia. The king raised his hand and the column halted. The sudden silence was oppressive. The good knight could hear his own breathing inside his helmet, the rasp of air through the nasal guard, the pounding of his heart. And then, from the slopes ahead, came the first sounds of the enemy. Chapter 2. The Screen. They came like ghosts from the olive groves. Andalusi jinetes on fast, agile mounts, their turbans bright against the dull green of the trees. They rode in loose formation, shouting insults in Arabic, their voices high and mocking. They carried javelins and small round shields, and they moved with a fluidity that spoke of years in the saddle. The good knight's hand went to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw. Not yet. This was the torna fouille, the feigned attack designed to provoke a premature charge. If the Christian knights broke formation now, if they spurred their heavy destriers up that slope in pursuit of these phantoms, they would arrive at the enemy's main line exhausted, their horses blown, their formation shattered. The jinetes rode closer, hurling their javelins. The weapons arced through the air, their iron points glinting. The good knight raised his kite shield, feeling the impact as a javelin struck the wood and leather surface. The force of the blow travelled up his arm, a sharp jolt that reminded him of the fragility of flesh. To his left, a squire was not so fortunate. The javelin took him in the throat, just above the mail collar. The boy made a sound, a wet, choking gasp, and toppled from his saddle. His horse, panicked by the smell of blood, bolted. Sancho made a small sound, something between a whimper and a prayer. The good knight reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder, hard. "Eyes forward," he said. "Don't look at him. There's nothing you can do." But the good knight looked. He always looked. The squire was young, perhaps 14. His blood was spreading across the rocky ground, pooling in the crevices between the stones. His eyes were open, staring at the sky with the blank incomprehension of the newly dead. The good knight had seen that look 1,000 times. It never became easier. From the groves, the Almoravid archers and slingers joined the assault. Arrows hissed through the air, and the sharp crack of slingstones against shields became a constant percussion. The Christian line held, but men were falling. A knight 3 files ahead took an arrow in the eye slit of his helmet and went down without a sound. Another was struck in the shoulder, the arrow punching through the mail rings and lodging in the muscle beneath. He screamed, a high animal sound, and his companions pulled him from the saddle before his thrashing horse could trample him. King Peter Thippert's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Infantry forward! Clear the groves!" The peonies and Almogavars surged past the mounted knights, their war cries a ragged chorus. The good knight watched as they disappeared into the olive trees, and within moments the sounds of close combat echoed back, the clash of steel on steel, the grunts of exertion, the screams of the wounded. The Almogavars were terrifying in their efficiency. They moved through the broken terrain like wolves, their javelins finding gaps in armor, their heavy knives finishing what the javelins began. The good knight had fought alongside them before, and he had learned to respect their brutal pragmatism. They did not fight for honor or glory. They fought for survival and plunder, and they were very, very good at both. Slowly, the Muslim skirmishers were pushed back. The jinetes wheeled their horses and retreated toward the walls of Xerica, their taunts fading into the distance. The Almogavars emerged from the groves, their faces flushed, their weapons slick with blood. They dragged the bodies of the fallen Muslim warriors behind them, already stripping them of anything valuable: weapons, armor, even clothing. The slope before the main gate was clear, and now, for the first time, the good knight could see the true enemy. Chapter 3. The Hedge of Steel. The Almoravid heavy infantry stood in a solid block before the Portal de la Sala, the main gate of Xerica's lower town. There were perhaps 500 of them, Lamtuna and Sanhaja Berbers, men who had crossed the Sahara to wage jihad against the Christian kingdoms of the north. They wore long robes over their armor, and their faces were wrapped in tagul must, the indigo veils that marked them as warriors of the desert. They had locked their shields, adagas, heart-shaped and made of layered antelope hide, into a continuous wall. Behind the shields, the points of their long pikes protruded like the quills of some monstrous beast. They did not shout. They did not move. They simply waited, a hedge of steel and faith. And then the drums began. The sound was like nothing the good knight had ever heard. It was not the martial rhythm of Christian war drums, but something deeper, more primal. The Almoravid drummers stood behind the infantry line, their massive instruments, tabl and darbuka, producing a thunderous rhythmic pulse that seemed to shake the very stones of the Peña Tejada. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying, until it felt as though the earth itself was beating with a terrible heart. The good knight's destrier shifted nervously beneath him, ears flattened, eyes rolling. Horses hated the drums. The sound bypassed reason and struck directly at the animal brain, triggering the instinct to flee. He leaned forward, stroking the destrier's neck, murmuring words that were lost in the drumming. "Easy, boy. Easy. We've been through worse." Another lie. He was not sure they had been through worse. King Peter Furs rode along the line of knights, his voice raised to be heard over the drums. "Form the cuneus, wedge formation. We break them here, and the town is ours." The knights began to maneuver, their horses stepping carefully on the rocky slope. The cuneus was the classic shock formation of heavy cavalry. A wedge, designed to concentrate force at a single point, to punch through an enemy line like a spear through flesh. The good knight found his place in the second rank, his lance held upright, his shield braced against his shoulder. To his right was Sir Rodrigo, a grizzled veteran whose face was a map of old scars. To his left was young Sir Guillem, barely 20, his armor so new it still gleamed. The three of them had ridden together for 2 years, had shared bread and wine and the long, cold watches of the night. They were not friends. The Mesnada did not encourage friendship, but they were brothers in a way that went deeper than blood. "Stay tight," Sir Rodrigo said, his voice rough. "When we hit, don't stop. If you stop, you die." Sir Guillem nodded, his face pale but determined. The good knight said nothing. There was nothing to say. King Peter Poorsister raised his lance, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he lowered it, pointing toward the Almoravid line, and spurred his horse. Forward. The charge began. Chapter 4. The Collision. The acceleration was agonizingly slow. The slope worked against them, sapping the momentum that was the heavy cavalry's greatest weapon. The good knight leaned forward in his saddle, his lance couched under his arm, the weight of it familiar and terrible. The drumming grew louder, impossibly louder, until it was the only sound in the world. He could see individual faces now in the Almoravid line, dark eyes above the indigo veils, eyes that held no fear, only a cold, fanatical certainty. These men believed they were fighting for God, that death in battle would open the gates of paradise. That belief made them dangerous in a way that went beyond mere skill or courage. The distance closed. 50 yards. 40. 30. The good knight lowered his lance, aiming for the gap between two shields. His world narrowed to that single point, that single target. Everything else, the drumming, the screams, the thunder of hooves, faded into a distant roar. 20 yards. The Almoravid line did not waver. The pikes lowered, a forest of iron points. 10 yards. The good knight braced himself, every muscle tensed for the impact. And then they hit. The collision was not clean. The Almoravid line did not shatter. The adagas, those layered shields of antelope hide, absorbed the lance points, flexing but holding. The good knight felt his lance strike the shield, felt the wood shudder, and then explode into splinters. The force of the impact travelled up his arm, a shock that left his shoulder numb. His destrier, struck by a pike in the chest caparison, reared and stalled. The momentum of the charge was gone. The wedge had not broken through. Instead, it had become mired in the Almoravid line, a grinding, static melee where there was no room to maneuver, no space to breathe. The good knight dropped the shattered lance and drew his broadsword. All around him, the air was filled with the metallic clatter of weapons on armor, the screams of men and horses, the wet, tearing sounds of steel finding flesh. He swung the sword, a wide horizontal cut aimed at the head of the nearest Almoravid. The man ducked, and the blade struck his shield instead, biting deep into the layered hide. The good knight wrenched the sword free and swung again, this time connecting with the man's shoulder. The mail beneath the robe held, but the force of the blow drove the man to his knees. Before the good knight could finish him, another Almoravid stepped into the gap, this one wielding a heavy mace. The weapon came up in a brutal arc, aimed at the good knight's head. He raised his shield, but he was too slow. The mace struck the side of his helmet, just above the ear. The nasal guard protected his face, but the concussive force was devastating. The world exploded into white light and ringing noise. His vision blurred, narrowing to a tunnel. He could not hear. He could not think. He was no longer a knight, no longer a man. He was a thing of pure instinct, swinging his sword, at shapes that might have been enemies or might have been shadows. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. He was aware of his sword rising and falling, aware of the impacts traveling up his arm, but he could not connect these sensations to any coherent reality. He was fighting in a dream or a nightmare, where the rules of the waking world no longer applied. Somewhere in the chaos, he saw Sir Guillem go down. A pike had found the gap beneath his arm, where the mail was thinnest. The young knight's scream was high and terrible, and then it was cut short as a mace crushed his helmet. The good knight wanted to go to him, wanted to pull him from the press, but there was no room, no time. The melee was a living thing, a crushing, suffocating mass of bodies and steel. He swung his sword again, and this time it connected with flesh. He felt the blade bite through mail and muscle, felt the resistance and then the sudden give as the edge found bone. The Almoravid warrior fell, and the good knight stepped over him, his boots slipping in the blood that was already pooling on the rocky ground. His vision was clearing, the ringing in his ears fading to a dull roar. He could see Sir Rodrigo to his right, still fighting, his sword red to the hilt. He could see the Almoravid line, still holding, still unbroken. And then, from the left flank, came the sound that would change everything, the high, ululating war cry of the Almogavars. Chapter 5. The flank the Almogavars had done what the heavy cavalry could not. While the knights pinned the Almoravid centre, the light infantry had scaled the steeper, rockier terrain to the north of the gate, ground the Almoravids had deemed impassable for any significant force. They emerged on the flank of the Muslim line like a sudden storm, their javelins raining down on the tightly packed Berber warriors. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Almoravid phalanx designed to resist frontal assault had no defense against this flanking attack. The javelins found gaps in armor, struck men in the neck and face, punched through the layered hide of the adagas. The disciplined formation began to waver, men turning to face the new threat, breaking the shield wall. The good knight, his head still ringing from the mace blow, saw the opening. He did not think. He simply moved, spurring his destrier forward into the gap. Sir Rodrigo was beside him, and a handful of other knights, all of them sensing that the moment had come. The Almoravid line shattered. What had been a disciplined phalanx became a panicked mob. The Berber warriors, caught between the charging knights and the Almogavar javelins, broke and ran. Some tried to retreat to the upper citadel, scrambling up the narrow streets of the lower town. Others threw down their weapons and begged for quarter. Most simply died, cut down by the Christian knights and infantry who poured through the breach. The good knight found himself in the narrow streets of the lower town, his sword rising and falling with a mechanical rhythm. He was no longer shaken. He was no longer afraid. He was simply a tool, an instrument of violence, doing what he had been trained to do. He saw an Almoravid warrior, young, perhaps no older than Sancho, cowering in a doorway. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his hands raised in supplication. The good knight hesitated, his sword poised to strike. And in that moment of hesitation, he saw Sir Guillem's face, saw the young knight's helmet crushed, saw the blood spreading across the stones. He brought the sword down. The fighting continued for another hour, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The lower town was in Christian hands. The surviving Almoravid warriors had retreated to the upper citadel, barricading themselves behind the final walls. King Peter III, surveying the carnage, decided not to press the assault. The citadel could be starved out. The Basusca, strategic objective, control of the road to Valencia, had been achieved. The good knight dismounted in what had once been the town square. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the melee draining away, leaving only exhaustion and pain. He removed his helmet, and the cool air on his face was a blessing. His head throbbed where the mace had struck, and when he touched the spot, his fingers came away sticky with blood. Sancho appeared at his side, the boy's face streaked with tears and grime. "Sir Guillem," Sancho said, his voice breaking. He's... I know," the good knight said. "I saw." He wanted to say more, wanted to offer some comfort, but the words would not come. What comfort was there? Sir Guillem was dead. The squire who had taken the javelin to the throat was dead. Dozens of men, Good men, brave men, were dead. And for what? A fortress, a road, a strategic objective that would be forgotten in a generation. The good knight sat down heavily on the edge of a stone fountain. The water in the basin was red with blood. He stared at it, his mind empty, his body numb. Sir Rodrigo limped over, his left leg dragging. He had taken a pike thrust to the thigh, and the mail had held, but the bruising would be spectacular. "We won," Sir Rodrigo said, his voice flat. "Yes," the good knight said, "we won." They sat in silence, two men who had survived, surrounded by those who had not. Chapter 6. The cost. The battlefield was a charnel house. The slope before the gate was carpeted with bodies, Christian and Muslim, knight and foot soldier, all of them reduced to the same broken meat. The Almogavars moved among the dead with the efficiency of scavengers, stripping armor and weapons, cutting purses from belts, prying rings from fingers. It was brutal work, but necessary. A mail hauberk was worth a fortune. A good sword could feed a family for a year. The good knight watched them work, his mind distant. He had been through this before, had seen the aftermath of battle, but it never became easier. The dead did not look like heroes. They looked like what they were, men who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose luck had run out, whose skill had not been quite enough. A barber surgeon approached, a thin man with a face like a hatchet and hands that were surprisingly gentle. He examined the good knight's head wound, probing the swollen flesh with careful fingers. "Concussion," the surgeon said. "You're lucky. The helmet saved your life, but you'll need to rest. No riding for at least 3 days." The good knight nodded, and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his skull. The surgeon cleaned the wound with wine, the alcohol burning like fire, and then applied a poultice of herbs, betony and rue, mixed with honey. He wrapped the good knight's head in a linen bandage, working with the practiced ease of a man who had treated hundreds of such injuries. "You'll live," the surgeon said, "though you may wish you hadn't, come morning. The headache will be fierce." The good knight managed a weak smile. "I've had worse." Another lie. But lies were all he had left. As the sun set, the Christian dead were gathered for burial. They were laid out in rows in a field outside the town walls, their hands folded over their chests, their weapons placed beside them. A priest moved among them, murmuring prayers, making the sign of the cross over each body. The good knight stood at the edge of the field, watching as Sir Guillem was laid to rest. The young knight's armor had been removed, revealing the terrible wound beneath his arm. His face, what was left of it, was peaceful. The good knight wanted to believe that Sir Guillem had found peace, that he was in heaven, feasting with the saints. But he could not. All he could see was waste, a life cut short, potential unfulfilled. Sir Rodrigo stood beside him, leaning on a crutch. "He was a good lad," Sir Rodrigo said. "Yes," the good knight said. "He was. He died well, fighting for his king, for God." The good knight said nothing. He was not sure Sir Guillem had died well. He was not sure there was such a thing as dying well. There was only dying, and the silence that came after. The Muslim dead were left where they had fallen, or dragged to a mass grave outside the walls. There would be no prayers for them, no consecrated ground. They were the enemy, and in death, as in life, they were denied the dignity afforded to Christians. The good knight thought of the young Almoravid warrior he had killed in the doorway, the boy with the terrified eyes. He wondered if that boy had a name, a family, a life beyond the war. He wondered if anyone would mourn him. Probably not. The frontier was a place where men died and were forgotten, where the living moved on because to dwell on the dead was to invite madness. Chapter 7. The Night Watch. That night, the good knight could not sleep. His head throbbed with a relentless, pulsing pain, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the melee, the crush of bodies, the flash of steel, Sir Guilem's scream. He lay in his tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp. Men were celebrating. They had won. They had taken the town. There would be plunder and glory and songs. But the good knight felt none of it. He felt only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a sadness that had no name. Sancho sat in the corner of the tent, polishing the good knight's armor. The boy worked in silence, his movements mechanical. He had not spoken since the battle, and the good knight did not press him. Some things could not be spoken. Some things had to be carried alone. Around midnight, Sir Rodrigo limped into the tent, carrying a wineskin. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering the skin. The good knight took it and drank deeply. The wine was rough and sour, but it dulled the pain in his head, and that was enough. "How's the leg?" the good knight asked. "I'll live," Sir Rodrigo said, "though I'll be walking like an old man for a month." They sat in silence, passing the wineskin back and forth. Outside, the celebration continued, but here, in the tent, there was only the quiet companionship of men who had survived. "Do you ever wonder?" the good knight said finally. "If it's worth it?" Sir Rodrigo looked at him, his scarred face unreadable. "Every day," he said. "But what else is there? This is what we are. This is what we do." The good knight nodded. It was true. He was a knight. He had been trained from boyhood to fight, to kill, to serve his king. There was no other life for him, no other path. The sword was all he knew, but that did not make it easier. That did not make the dead any less dead. "Guilhem was a good lad," Sir Rodrigo said again, as if repetition could make it true, could give the death meaning. "Yes," the good knight said. "He was." They drank until the wineskin was empty, and then Sir Rodrigo limped back to his own tent, leaving the good knight alone with his thoughts. Sancho had fallen asleep in the corner, his head resting on the good knight's shield. The boy's face was peaceful, innocent. The good knight envied him that innocence. Even as he knew, it would not last. The frontier had a way of stripping away innocence, of revealing the brutal truth beneath the songs and stories. The good knight lay back down, pulling his cloak over himself. His head still throbbed, and his body ached from a dozen bruises and cuts. But he was alive. He had survived. And in the morning he would rise, and he would ride, and he would do it all again. Because that was what he was. That was what he did. He closed his eyes, and this time, sleep came. Chapter 8. The morning after, dawn broke cold and grey over Jerica. The good knight woke to the sound of men breaking camp, the clatter of armor, and the low murmur of voices. His head still ached, a dull, persistent throb that made his eyes water, but it was bearable. He sat up slowly, testing his body, cataloguing the damage. His shoulder was stiff where the lance had shattered. His ribs were bruised from the press of the melee. His hands were cut and blistered from gripping the sword. But he was whole. He was alive. Sancho was already awake, heating water over a small fire. The boy brought the good knight a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of watered wine. The good knight ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind elsewhere. King Peter I had called a council of his commanders. The good knight, as a member of the royal mesnada, was expected to attend. He dressed slowly, wincing as he pulled the mail hauberk over his head, feeling the weight settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The council was held in the town square, in the shadow of the citadel that still held out above. The king stood on the steps of what had been the mosque, now hastily consecrated as a church. Around him were the lords and knights who had led the assault. "The lower town is ours," King Peter I said, his voice carrying across the square. "The road to Valencia is secure. The Almoravid garrison is bottled up in the citadel, and they will surrender or starve. This is a great victory." There were cheers, but they were muted. The men had seen the cost. They had counted the dead. "We will leave a garrison here," the king continued. 50 men under the command of Sir Berengar. The rest of us will move south to join El Cid at Sagunto. The Reconquista continues." More cheers, louder this time, the promise of more battles, more plunder, more glory. The GoodKnight did not cheer. He simply stood, his face impassive, his mind numb. After the council, he walked through the lower town, surveying the damage. The streets were littered with debris, broken weapons, shattered shields, the detritus of war. The buildings bore the scars of the fighting, walls pocked with arrow strikes, doors smashed in, roofs collapsed. In one doorway, he saw the body of the young Almoravid warrior he had killed. The boy's eyes were still open, staring at nothing. The GoodKnight knelt beside him and gently closed the eyes. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it was all he could offer. "Forgive me," he whispered, though he did not know if he was asking forgiveness from the boy, or from God, or from himself. He stood and walked on, his silver armor catching the pale morning light. Chapter 9. The road south. 3 days later, the Aragonese host broke camp and began the march south toward Sagunto. The GoodKnight rode in his accustomed place, his head still bandaged, his body still aching. Sancho rode beside him, silent and watchful. The road followed the Palancia River, winding through the limestone gorges and terraced slopes. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, a beauty that had nothing to do with men and their wars, a beauty that would endure long after they were all dust. The GoodKnight thought about Sir Guillem, about the young Almoravid warrior, about all the men who had died at Xerica. He thought about the battles to come, the sieges and skirmishes that would mark the slow, grinding advance of the Reconquista. He thought about the years stretching ahead, years of violence and loss, years of riding toward fortresses and fighting in the shadow of walls. And he thought about the fact that he would survive. He always survived. That was his curse and his gift. He would walk through history, a witness to the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of empires. He would see things that no man should see, and he would carry the weight of those memories until the end of time. But for now, he rode. The sun was warm on his face, and the road stretched ahead, and there was a strange comfort in the rhythm of the horse's hooves, in the familiar weight of the armor, in the knowledge that he was not alone. Sir Rodrigo rode beside him, his leg still bandaged but healing. The old knight caught the GoodKnight's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of shared survival. Ahead, the banners of Aragon snapped in the wind, red and gold against the blue sky. Behind, the fortress of Jerica receded into the distance, its walls already fading into memory. The GoodKnight touched the bandage on his head, feeling the dull ache beneath. He was shaken. He was bloodied. He had lost brothers in arms whose names he would carry to his grave. But he was alive. And the road went on. Chapter 10. The Legacy. Weeks later, when the wound on his head had healed to a pale scar, the GoodKnight stood on the walls of Sagunto and looked north, toward the mountains where Jerica lay hidden in its valley. The siege of Sagunto was progressing slowly, the massive fortress resisting every assault. But the outcome was not in doubt. With Xerica secured, the supply lines were safe. The Almoravid garrison had no hope of relief. El Cid himself had ridden out to inspect the siege lines, and the GoodKnight had seen him from a distance. A man of middle years, his face weathered by sun and war, his eyes sharp and calculating. The Cid was a legend, a man who had carved a principality from the chaos of the frontier through sheer will and tactical brilliance. But up close he looked like what he was. A man. Mortal. Fallible. The GoodKnight wondered if the Cid ever felt shaken, ever felt the weight of the dead, ever questioned the cost of his victories. Probably. But if he did not show it. That was the difference between a legend and a man. Legends did not doubt. Men did. Sancho approached, carrying the GoodKnight's sword, freshly sharpened and oiled. "Sir," the boy said, "the king has called for you. There's to be another council." The GoodKnight nodded and took the sword, buckling it to his belt. The weight was familiar, comforting. He had carried a sword for so long that he felt incomplete without it. As he walked toward the king's pavilion, he thought about the skirmish of Jerica. It had been a small battle, a footnote in the grand narrative of the Reconquista. But for the men who had fought there, for the men who had died there, it had been everything. It had been the moment when their lives had ended or changed forever. The GoodKnight had changed. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the way he saw the world. He was harder now, more cynical. The songs of the troubadours rang hollow in his ears. The promises of glory and honor seemed like lies told to children. But he would continue. He would ride to the next battle, and the next, and the next, because that was what he was. That was what he did. And perhaps, in some distant future, when the wars were over and the frontier was finally secure, he would find peace. Perhaps he would lay down his sword and rest. But not yet. Not today. Today there was work to do. There were walls to breach and enemies to fight, and a kingdom to build from the ashes of the old world. The GoodKnight entered the king's pavilion, his silver armor gleaming in the lamplight, his face set in the impassive mask of the professional soldier. And the war went on. Epilogue. The Silver Night, years later, when Sagunto had fallen and Valencia had been secured, when the Almoravid tide had been turned and the Christian kingdoms had pushed their frontier ever southward, an old man sat in a monastery in the mountains of Aragon and told stories to the young monks. He told them about the skirmish of Jerica, about the charge up the slope and the clash of steel on steel, about the Almogavar flanking maneuver and the shattering of the Almoravid line. He told them about Sir Guillem, who had died with a pike through his ribs, and about Sir Rodrigo, who had limped for the rest of his life but had never stopped fighting. And he told them about the GoodKnight, the man in silver armor who had survived when so many others had not, who had carried the weight of the dead and the memory of the battles through all the years that followed. The young monks listened, their eyes wide, and they asked if the stories were true. The old man smiled, a sad, distant smile. "True?" he said. "What is truth? The battles happened. The men died. The kingdoms rose and fell. Whether the details are exact, whether the GoodKnight was exactly as I describe him, does it matter? The truth is in the telling. The truth is in the memory." He paused, staring into the fire that crackled in the monastery's hearth. "The GoodKnight survived Jerica," he said softly. "He survived Sagunto and 100 other battles. He survived because he had to, because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to remember." The old man fell silent, and the young monks did not press him. They could see the weight in his eyes, the burden of memory that no amount of time could erase. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the ghosts of the past, the screams of the dying, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves on stone. And somewhere, in the shadows of history, the good knight rode on, his silver armor gleaming, his sword ready, his eyes fixed on the horizon, because the war was never truly over. The battles might end, the kingdoms might rise and fall, but the struggle, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, life and death, that went on forever. And the good knight would be there, walking through the centuries, a witness to it all. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.